The Australian convicts weren't convicts, they were slaves. Slave, the definition, a person who is forced to work for and obey another and is considered to be their property, an enslaved person. The current narrative wants you to believe that you are the descendants of colonizers, that you don't get to have a say in how this country is run because you stole it from somebody else. There is one small problem, however, and that is you didn't steal anything. Neither did your parents, neither did your grandparents. Your great-grandparents didn't steal anything either, nor did their parents. There is a small chance, however, that somewhere within your lineage, a very distant relative was scooped up from the side of the road just going about their business in their hometown of Brittan, charged and convicted of a crime that they most likely didn't commit on the basis of evidence that was probably never provided, thrown onto a disease-ridden ship for 250 days on a voyage from which they would likely never return, to be sentenced to hard labour 6 days a week from sun-up to sundown for no pay and with nothing to show for it except the vague and distant prospect of freedom after an average of 14 years of servitude. G'day my fellow Aussie legends. Today we are breaking the paradigm of Australia's oldest and perhaps most misinterpreted stories. The Australian convicts weren't convicts. They were slaves, actually. This video will offer a new perspective on the individuals who, for the longest time, have been portrayed as nothing more than thieves and scoundrels, when in fact, these individuals got away with far less criminal activity than the current youth of today, and were dealt with in a way that can really only bring us to one logical conclusion. Let's get into it. In 1786, the British government had assigned itself a new task of taking the vast and apparently uninhabited country of Terra Nullius. The government had a job to do, a new continent to colonise, and what they needed in order to carry out this objective was a reliable, controllable and expendable labour force. They needed the workers to be young, less prone to injury with increased longevity, impressionable, naturally fearful of and easily overwhelmed by authority, and they needed them to be unattached with either small or non-existent family ties. Whilst this person existed in sizable quantities within the English population, unfortunately for the British government, there was one problem. How were they going to convince this demographic to give up their lives in mainland Britain, as wretched as they were, for a one-way ticket to a desolate hellscape, living off rations in a forced labour camp? The cold, hard reality, of course, was that no matter how they framed it, there was just no conceivable way that they were going to be able to market this prospect to the masses and convince people to go. So what did they do instead? The answer is as clever as it is fiendish. However, before we reveal the dastardly plans of the British ruling elite and how they managed to build an entire nation off the backs of wayward peasants, it is necessary to provide a historical snapshot of what life was truly like in late 18th century England, so as to ultimately understand the decision-making process. The beginning of 1760 marked a significant turning point in the English tradition. For the first time in her illustrious history, the mother country was becoming industrialised, and whilst this proved to be of benefit for some, it was for the majority a rapidly emerging dystopian nightmare. Advances in machinery designed to increase farming efficiency would see the consequential displacement of rural workers who would inevitably move into the city in search of employment. Coinciding with the mass migration of unemployed farmers, cities like London would also see the return of British soldiers from the 7 Years' War against France and its allies. And as a consequence, the city centres would give rise to an unmitigated swelling of its population, resulting in dire social and economic conditions. Characterised by unemployment, immense poverty, a booming illicit sex trade, and increases in crime, children were often neglected and left to fend for themselves. During this time, it was extremely common for orphans as young as 6 years old to be seen wandering the streets begging for food, leaving most of these children with the devastating choice of either starving to death or having to steal to survive. Most children found themselves in this position, ultimately chose the latter, and it is here in the chaos and social upheaval of Great Britain that the solutions to the overpopulated cities were initially hatched. Further to the unprecedented influx of city residents, English city residents, and the resulting increases in crime, English prisons had also reached a breaking point. Things were so bad that the British government ordered the building of hulks, which were replica ships permanently docked at the sides of the River Thames and in the Portsmouth harbour of London. Whilst these floating prisons initially started out as fully operational vessels, the haphazard extensions built into the ship's structure to accommodate the expanding criminal contingent eventually rendered them unseaworthy. It was here, in the settling dust of a major war, with the city beyond its breaking point, that the ruling class decided it was time to expand its empire. Prior to 1785, the idea of colonising Australia was largely dismissed by the British government due to the hefty cost involved. In fact, the motion to spread the empire to the mysterious southern land was rejected by Parliament on 2 separate occasions, first in 1779 and then again in 1785. However, this sentiment quickly changed upon the receipt of a handwritten note in the summer of 1786. The now infamous note contained details about French plans to enlarge their presence in the Pacific. After their defeat and the subsequent loss of a number of their colonies, the French had bold new plans to come back bigger and stronger by expanding their empire deep into the southern hemisphere. Their plans were thwarted, however, after an intelligence leak by an American who was at the time sympathetic to the British Crown. The Brits were left with no choice and leapt immediately into action. Thanks to the contents of this fateful letter, the British government were now of the knowledge that in order to stave off their enemies' plans for expansion, they had to get there first. Within the coming months, the British government commissioned the procurement of 11 ships with the expressed purpose of transporting prisoners to a far-off land, with the intention of creating an agricultural and trading stronghold, a place that they had termed New South Wales. And on the 8th of January 1788, the First Fleet, commanded by Captain Arthur Phillip, containing 750 slaves and their masters, landed on the shores of Botany Bay, and the rest, as they say, is history. The declaration of its expansion into the south could not have come at a more opportune time. And in a proverbial sense, the British government was finally able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, it could significantly rid itself of the burden of having to detain hordes of criminals that had stowed away in its prisons and hulks, whilst at the same time utilising their services as forced labour to clear land and build the infrastructure necessary for colonisation. There was one last problem though. How do you get the heavy-handed offenders, guilty of crimes worthy of transportation, to behave themselves? How do you stop them from performing a mutiny, either on the ship or within the settlement camps? The answer was both ruthless and cunning, and can be found in a common characteristic shared by a great number of the so-called convicts. Prior to the dispatching of the First Fleet in 1788, transportation, to which it was so menacingly referred, was strictly reserved for the most cold-blooded criminal. Up until the mid-decades of the 18th century, only serious crimes, that is capital offences, were punishable by transportation. This was used as an alternative to the death penalty. However, as a consequence of new legislation passed by the British government, it was now possible for people to be charged, convicted and transported where only minor offences were recorded. Thanks to the implementation of this devious legislation, offences that carried the sentence of transportation was to now include the stealing of livestock, tea, clothes, bedding, watches, mugs, and handkerchiefs. If found guilty, offenders would be transported for a minimum of 7 years. Other crimes worthy of banishment included forgery, bigamy, that is marrying a person while still married to someone else, and political dissent. Roughly 20% of the prisoners were female, with the remaining male contingent being of English and Welsh descent. Irish 24%, Scottish about 5%. The first fleet's journey from England to Botany Bay took approximately 8 months, or 252 days. It was through this crafty loophole that the British government were able to redefine the term convict, as well as the type of person who could now be considered one. With these new definitions in place, the state was able to zero in on its targeted demographic and thus able to legally and effortlessly fill its flotillas with the types of people who were previously unobtainable. The type of person who was unable to stand up for themselves and therefore physically incapable of performing a mutiny. The type of person they could easily manipulate into complying with company directives. The type of person who could be taken from the street, who would be missed by no one without even breaking a sweat. In other words, slaves. Contrary to what many of us might believe about the convicts that were sent to the great southern land, the overwhelming majority of prisoners were sentenced not for murder or for rape, but for the pettiest of crimes. Crimes that in modern times would warrant nothing more than a slap on the wrist, if that. In essence, these transported individuals, charged of crimes they likely didn't commit, sentenced by a corrupt legal system, forced to endure a life of hard labour in a place that at the time was considered to be another world away, where their every move was monitored and controlled by their tyrannical masters. These people weren't convicts, they were slaves, plain and simple. And the ships that transported these individuals were not convict fleets, they were slave ships. This was a brilliant strategy from the English because from a practical perspective, it just wouldn't make sense to indenture the services of hardened criminals characterised by the rapists and murderers that were overflowing the British prison cells. Can you imagine how difficult it would have been to get any land cleared or buildings built if the convicts were constantly evading detainment, to prey on female convicts working in the administration blocks within the settlements, or having convicted murderers continually running around trying to do each other in? What they needed and what they were eventually successful in obtaining were slaves. Young, scared, vulnerable slaves. And it wasn't just one or two, it was thousands. Between 1788 and 1868, a period of 80 years, 165,000 individuals with an average age of 22 were transported from Britain to Australia as punishment for the types of crimes that, if committed today, would barely even make the news. What's even more staggering is the fact that due to lengthy delays in processing, not to mention the 8 months at sea, most of these slaves would have been captured whilst they were still in their teens. The idea that Australian settlements were built not by convicts, but rather by slaves can be difficult to digest, as most of what we know from these people from a distant era in a far-off land who were deprived of their basic human rights and violated in the most egregious ways was taught to us when we ourselves were young and impressionable. However, now that our ability to discern truth from the contrived has reached its full effect, it might be worthwhile revisiting some of the stories and challenging some of the perspectives that have defined the collective history of an entire nation. As the truth, once realised, is far more shocking than we could have ever imagined. Take the story of John Hudson, for example. 8 years old, occupation, chimney sweep, alleged offence, break and enter, theft of a linen shirt, 5 silk stockings, a pistol, and 2 aprons. Sentence? Banished by way of transportation. The judge's sentencing remarks: John is extremely fortunate to have received the sentence of transportation, as offenders of his kind have been hanged for less. Contrary to what many Australians believe about the types of people who were transported, children like John made up an unthinkable proportion of those who were banished. During the 80 years of transportation, the archives provide cases where children numbering in the thousands were forced to embark on the perilous journey to Terra Nullius. Take our next convicts, for example. Dennis Finn, 12, stole a cloak, sentenced to transportation. John Dwyer, 12, sentenced for stealing a watch. Jeremiah Callahan, 15, stole a brass handle. John Donnelly, 13, offences unknown. William Toldwell, 14, stealing a pair of shoes. Elizabeth Hayward, 13, stealing a linen gown and a silk bonnet. Mary Wade, 14, stealing another child's clothes. The list goes on. How must these children have felt? Especially when we pause to consider that the reason these poor souls were being taken was not because they were senseless kleptomaniacs or the ringleaders of an organised handkerchief theft syndicate, but rather because they were orphaned, desperate, and starving to death. There was one more piece to the puzzle, however, that the British government needed to make this campaign successful. They already knew that the young boys they had arrested would inevitably grow into strong, expendable men. What they were lacking, however, was a tried and true labour force. What they ultimately needed in order to hit the ground running were the types of men who were well accustomed to all matters relating to toil and grit. Men who knew all too well what it was to make a living with nothing more than their bare hands. Where did they find these men? They found them, of course, in the form of the farmers that they had displaced. The very men who are now flocking to the cities in their droves as a result of being cut down by the unforgivable edge of industrialisation. The disgruntled, dissatisfied byproducts of progress, also known as political dissenters. The Told Puddle Martyrs. The Told Puddle Martyrs were from the village of Told Puddle, who formed a trade union in 1833 to protect their wage from cuts. They were arrested and sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia in 1834 for taking an oath to promote their union, which was at the time seen as illegal by the government. The labourers of Told Puddle were facing significant wage reductions, forcing them to near starvation levels. They formed the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers to address this. Fearful of organised labour, however, the government used an obscure law against unlawful oaths to prosecute them. Mass protests and support from prominent figures like Lord John Russell led to their pardon in 1836, and astonishingly, they returned to England. The case of the Told Puddle Martyrs helped establish the rights of working people to form trade unions, and they are considered heroes of the trade union movement today. The Luddites were textile workers that opposed new technology during the Industrial Revolution. They protested the introduction of textile machines that they feared would make their jobs obsolete. Today, the term Luddite is used to refer to someone who opposes the use of new technology. Despite various attempts of these movements and others like it to elicit fairer working, economic, political conditions throughout Greater Britain, it was quite common for vocal supporters of these types of movements to be arrested and tried for political dissent, where the inevitable outcome would result in transportation. The types of men who were skilled, displaced, and vagrant. This is what the British government needed to finish its conquest in the Great Southern Land, the perfect slave. In conclusion, through the use of shrewd legislation, the British government found a way to make slavery legal. In essence, this video has demonstrated that the only difference between slaves and British convicts is really just a slight definitional difference. Conceptually speaking, they're both exactly the same thing. Facilitated by the abhorrent living and working conditions of a country on the cusp of an industrial revolution, as well as the thirst for Southern Hemisphere domination, the British government cleverly seized its opportunity to enhance its empire by enslaving the very people their political system helped to create. The Australian convicts weren't convicts, they were slaves.